Let me tell you who I am. Many of you know me, but I just want to tell you that I am a psychotherapist. I've been in practice for over 30 years. I've been working with children, with couples, with families and individuals. I've worked in New York, I've worked in Israel, I've worked in Toronto with child and family clinics, as well as in private practice. And I've always been intrigued with how people change. What is it that stimulates people to make the decisions and the efforts to change their life? Because really, at the heart of psychotherapy, that is really what we're talking about, helping people to make changes. And it's not an easy thing to do, as I'm sure all of you know. It's not easy to change. It's hard to change. So I think that part of what I strive to do and have always strived to do, both in my own personal life and with people that I work with, is to live a more fulfilling life. But what does it mean to live a more fulfilling life? Well, I think it comes down to, this is my opinion, and we're going to talk a little bit about it through the course of the evening tonight. It's talking about creativity. It's what makes us live as full and thriving human beings, is the capacity to develop our creative impetus. And we're going to learn a little bit about that. I'll share with you the journey. I'm not an expert in this. I'm really just, and the book is really just, an opportunity to put together lots of ideas and thoughts that I've learned over the years and put it in a way that I think will help us understand how to access that information and then some strategies about how to implement it in our lives. Does that make sense? So I'm going to try out my new PowerPoint. So creativity. This is what Steve Jobs. Creativity is just connecting things. When you ask creative people how they did something, they feel a little guilty because they really didn't do it. They just saw something. It seemed obvious to them after a while. And that's because they were able to connect experiences they've had and synthesize new things. Now, probably Steve Jobs, creator of the iPhone, the iPad, Apple computers, what a creative genius. I think we'd all agree with that. And where did that come from? This is what he said about it. This is what he said about creativity. So when I thought about creativity, and I read this quote, thought about some of the research that I've done over the years, I think the first step that we need to think about is our brains. What is it about our brains? So this is current research, up to date. This was from the past year, done through MRI imaging, where they've been able to identify 3 different networks that function in the brain. One is the default mode, which is when the brain is at a resting state. The second is the executive control that monitors and directs decisions and choices. And the third is the salience network that determines what needs to be noticed. And creativity means to be able to connect things that you've seen, experienced, processed, and make those connections. There's an amazing study that was done at Stanford University. You can look it up on YouTube. There's a TED Talk by Bill Burnett. They did a study with university students where they divided into 2 groups. Those that identified on a pretest as being they identified themselves as being lucky in life. And the other group were those that identified as being unlucky in life. And they asked them to do this experiment. Each group was told to read the New York Times, front cover of the New York Times, and identify how many pictures were correlated to the articles in the front page section. So what happened was the people that, and if you did that and successfully did that right, you get $100. So the first group, they read through the New York Times, they identified how many pictures were correlated with the articles, they won their $100. The second group that identified as lucky, they read the same articles, but they noticed embedded in the articles was this text that said, if you read this, you get another $150. And they collected another $150. So Bill Burnett talks about the study wasn't about who could correlate the number of pictures to the articles. It was who would notice the hidden text. And the people that noticed them were the people that believed that they were lucky in life. So I think it's interesting, that idea of connectivity, that the brain is able to notice things. When you're paying attention and you're aware of things, you can make that connection. If we go back many, many years, probably the greatest brain researcher that I'm aware of that changed our thinking about brain development is Roger Sperry. Roger Sperry in the 1960s and 70s was the one that pioneered the understanding of the left brain as being the seat of logic, of language, and the right brain, something very, very different. It had a completely different function. I don't know if you've ever seen a brain, but if you take an actual brain, it can separate in two, and there's just one little connecting point. And what Roger Sperry talked about was the capacity to put the left brain to sleep, anesthetize the left brain, so it couldn't function, and they would hand the patient a fork and say, "What is it in your hand?" And the person couldn't identify what it was because the left brain was asleep. The left brain identifies what a fork is. A right brain doesn't know what a fork is. A right brain knows it's silver, it's cold, it's hard, those kinds of things, but it doesn't understand what a fork is and what it can be used for. The next thing I want to share with you is something that I discovered. I have her book here. A number of years ago, Betty Edwards, who was an art teacher, she did her work based on Roger Sperry's work, understanding left brain, right brain. Betty Edwards was an art teacher. And Betty Edwards was a keen observer of human nature. And when she was working with her students, she would say to them, "Just draw what you see." And the people would get frustrated. They'd say, "But we are drawing what we see." Well, what she discovered was, and if I asked all of you to draw a picture of me, and I gave you pencil and paper, probably what you would draw would be like a grade school drawing, unless you've had some training. You would draw a circle for my face and a couple of circles for my eyes and maybe a beard, but it wouldn't look anything like me. Because what you'd be doing essentially is drawing from your left brain. And your left brain will tell you that's a face, that's an eye, that's a nose. Your right brain, which you won't be using, is the one that can tell you the shade, the distance, the color, the depth. That's the function of the right brain. I'm going to show you two before and after pictures, and what you'll see is that's kind of how most of us would draw a person. The perspective is completely off, and you know why that is? One of the things that people in art school learn, the first thing they learn is to draw like a plus sign, and that's where the eyes are in the human head, at that center point. But we don't think of that because our left brain, when we look at a face, we're focusing on their eyes. But we don't notice the perception and where those eyes are in relation to the rest of the head. And that's why the drawing looks so distorted, because that's the left brain drawing. After minimal training, how long do you think it took to be able to draw this? Would you think years, months, weeks? It's actually a couple of lessons. It takes a couple of lessons. And her book is here. I've done some of the exercises. You could learn to do the same because it's just a simple matter of switching to your right brain and from your left brain. And people who draw naturally, they just naturally learn to access their right brain. And people who have had that training, they can certainly get better at it. But just the basics of drawing from the right side of the brain allows you to draw something that's really quite remarkable. So now I want to share with you an idea, and just allow me to share this with you. Whether you believe in the Bible, whether you believe in the story of creation isn't the point. Allow me some time to just share with you what many, many years ago was an unbelievable awakening for me. And that's when I read the story of creation. And there are actually two stories of creation. I don't know if you're aware of that. I don't know if you've ever heard that idea before. But the first one is, it said, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created him, and God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. So what that says is God created a fully formed androgynous being and said, take over the world. I've given you the world. It's yours. But the problem is that a couple of sentences later in that paragraph, it says, and then the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Well, which is it? They're two very different stories. And I was very perplexed when I was exposed to this in my graduate school training. How to reconcile that? So there's a great rabbi by the name of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. He wrote a book, which I have here tonight, Halachic Men. I think it's great that we're doing this in a library, by the way, and I wanted you to see the books that have had influences over me because I think they've been very profound. And think about all the hundreds and hundreds of books out there that like the libraries are disappearing, right? But we still have to read. We still have to learn. We still have to hear other people's perspectives because it enlightens our lives. So Rabbi Soloveitchik, what he did is he came up with a fascinating idea. And he called it Adam 1 and Adam 2. So the first story of creation is a description of the creation of Adam 1. Adam 1 is a physical being. And it's about understanding the world around us, creating the internet, skyscrapers, learning how to fly planes, making automobiles, all the things that are, how do you do this? How do you make this happen in this world? Adam 2, on the other hand, is a completely different being. Adam 2 is a spiritual being that seeks transcendence. And Adam 2, that part of ourselves, and I'm going to share with you that I think what Soloveitchik is saying is that these are both parts of our creation. That's part of our nature. That is the nature of humankind. We have a physical being and we have a spiritual being, and our spirit seeks transcendence and understanding of why we're here. The big questions, like what's life all about? So the Genesis paradigm is what describes the natural duality of man's soul, his beings. Human beings are created with both the striving for perfection, which is our spiritual side, but also worldly mastery, which is our physical side. And these two aspects to our nature are always at play. And if we use them properly, we will have a more fulfilling creative life. So here's my idea that I want to share with you to think about. We talked about understanding brain and brain research, two very different hemispheres with two very different functions in the world, two very different ways of interacting and interfacing with the world. And we have these dual natures. So my preposition here is that our left brain is designed to help us master the world and interact with the world, and our right brain is meant to help our soul find transcendence and a place to exist in this world. It's a complicated idea, but that's kind of the background to where we're going to go. So if you think about how we're going to take all of that capacity and live a more creative, fulfilling life, that's what the next part of the talk is about. And in my book, I talk about all these ideas in a little bit of different ways than I am tonight, but I'm sharing with you basically the fundamental ideas that I think are really, really important if we're going to make changes in our life and live more fulfilled lives. So I'm going to go through these next 5 things, which I think are really the strategies. We talked about strategies for creative living. Now that we have the background of being understanding a little bit more about how our brain functions and about understanding connectivity and the two functions of our left brain, right brain, and the two natures that we all have within us, that physical part and that spiritual part. And that's the need to have a developed imagination. How are we going to cope with change? How are we going to deal with change? Interference, because there's going to be interference, which we're going to talk about, which is a little bit like resistance, meaning, and pain. So one of the things that I'm aware of, and some of you are professionals in the room, and when people come to me for therapy, it's really fascinating to me that they come with problems and conflicts and issues that they want my help, and we inevitably reach a point where I realize that they're going to have to change something about what they think and how they see the world. And what's ironic is at that point, people tend to dig in even more to their long-held beliefs. They don't want to give up the very thing that is causing them that pain and conflict. And yet that is what is going to need to happen. And so these are some of the things that I've learned in my practice over the many years that will help people make those changes. So let's go through them. Albert Einstein said that imagination is more important than knowledge. Imagination and creativity are two sides to a dynamic tension. As we imagine something, which may be of a higher order of seeing, we begin to take steps to bring that into reality. So I would imagine that everybody here tonight has had experiences in their life where they felt this is an amazing world, where everything just felt right, everything seemed brighter and clearer, and you were living kind of like on the crest of a wave. Remember those times when you had that, like a peak experience, they talk about it, where you just felt like everything was running really, really well? That's what we're going to try to understand. How do you make that happen more of the time? So most of us, we leave imagination like our right brains. We left them behind in grade school. If you watch kids play, it's amazing how they use their imagination. They see things that aren't there. They talk to people who aren't there. They pretend there's somebody that they're not. And it brings tremendous joy to their lives to be able to imagine things. Well, as adults, we need to do the same thing. Steve Jobs, I assure you, had an amazing imagination. I think about Elon Musk now, right? Developing I just read now he's developed this new, what is it called, the Starship. It was in the news today. I watched that. I don't know if anybody saw this, the launch of Falcon Heavy. Are you people aware of that? It's called the Falcon Heavy. It's SpaceX, his company, that is planning to populate the planet Mars. They're well on their way. So look it up, because he believes it's going to happen in our lifetime. And one of the secrets to being able to land and colonize Mars, is the only way that can ever happen is we have reusable rockets. NASA gave up on this a long time ago and gave it over to private enterprise. How is anybody going to come up with a reusable rocket? I don't know if you saw the launch, but they sent up this amazing ship, and he actually included in the payload, because they just wanted to test it. It wasn't for any purpose other than to test whether this would work. Did people see that? His car. He actually sent his car with Spaceman up into space, and we have photographs of that car floating in space. But that's not the fascinating part of it. That was just the fun part. The fascinating part was he went outside where the launch took place, and after the rocket went up, the two booster rockets came back down to Earth and landed on a landing pad simultaneously. Two giant booster rockets landed on these pads simultaneously. That all came from his imagination. It never existed before. And everybody said it's impossible. Can't do it. Well, he did it. That's why Einstein said imagination is more important than knowledge. Imagination comes first. The knowledge comes afterwards. You have to create the knowledge. That's what Steve Jobs was trying to give us that clue about. You have to create how you did it afterwards. But the imagination is really the part that brought it into being. We can all do that. Now, if I asked you to tell me words that come to your mind when I asked you to think about change, when you've had to change in your life, well, these are some of the words that people have told me. Fear, anxiety, the unknown, death, uncomfortable, unpredictable. Does that sound familiar when you think about change? But yet, I'll tell you something. There's a whole other list that other people say. Exciting, liberating, hopeful, energizing, healing, fun. Now, how could that be? How could we have these two completely disparate ideas about what change means? So I think one of the things that we can understand about that is that we have a brain that functions 24/7. This comes from a book called The Untethered Soul. And in that book, he talks about this voice. We are all aware of that voice that exists in our head that tells us terrible things about people and blames people. Because this is what we set up. We said to our brain, imagine, I want everybody to like me. I don't want anyone to speak badly of me. I want everything I say and do to be acceptable and pleasing to everyone. I don't want to I don't want anyone to hurt me. I don't want anything bad to happen that I don't like. And now, mind, figure it out and make this a reality. And of course, your mind said, I'm on it, 24/7. That's what your mind will do. Your brain left unchecked, in the words of mindfulness training, it's called the runaway horse. It's like a horse that broke out of the stable, broke out of the barn, and it's just running rampant. That's what our brains want to do. So when we start to change, our brains don't like that because it causes all kinds of things that are unpredictable. People who didn't come tonight are people who struggle to change. People who don't do things are the people who struggle to change because we seek comfort. We are comfort creatures. If you want to live a creative life, you can't be seeking comfort. Comfort doesn't come when you're looking for creativity. You have to be able to be facing some kind of discomfort and be able to tolerate the discomfort. The best example I can share with you is something I've used for many, many years. It comes from a book called Transitions. The idea of change is like imagining that there's a curb on this side of the road and there's a curb on that side of the road. And I want to get to the other side. Now, I don't know what's on the other side. The other side might be a better job, better marriage. It might be more money, more travel. Whatever it is that's on the other side, you don't know what it is when you're on this side. All you can do is say, okay, I want to change. I don't like where I am, and I want to get over there. Okay, so what happens is we take a couple of tentative steps, and I see it all the time in therapy. And very quickly you go back. Why? Because we don't like being in that unpleasant state where we're not sure what's going to happen. right? Our brain is telling us, whoa, wait a minute. I don't like this feeling. I like being where I was. So I'm going to suggest that what you have to imagine between this curve and that curve is an island in the middle. And all you have to do, if you want to succeed at really changing, is get to the island in the middle. If you can be in the island in the middle, now it's still scary, right? There's cars zipping by on either side of you, but you're perfectly safe. If you just stay on the island, you're perfectly safe. The island is a necessary place because whatever I've left and whatever I want to get to, I need time to adapt and learn and grow and reach for something different than who I was there, which we all have the capacity to do. But in order to do it, we have to be able to tolerate that discomfort, tell ourselves that it's okay. It's okay to come out in the cold. It's okay to extend myself. It's okay to miss a night's sleep. Whatever the issues and challenges that we have in our life when we're trying to accomplish something, it's okay, because that's the only way you're going to ever reach that other side. Now, once you're over here, it's a very different perspective than what you had over there, because now you're somebody different. You've adapted to a new persona. You've developed new skills, new capacities, and I can tell you that it's an amazing feeling. I'm sure you've all had that experience. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know. It's just a way of conceptualizing it while understanding those two concepts that we've talked about earlier, that physical and spiritual part, and also the functions of our brain. So one of the things that I learned many years ago from a great psychotherapist by the name of Rollo May is that depression comes from a lack of meaning. You need to have meaning in life. And maybe it's apropos to share this example, but one of the things that the Nazis did during the war and at the times that people were in camps is they gave them useless work. They would build a wall and tear it down. And they build a wall again and tear it down. And it's really a form of torture to make somebody do something where there's absolutely no meaning in what you're doing. So when we think about our own lives, I think a lot of us do go through our days that way, when we could do something very different. I'll give you a very simple example. If you're shopping for food for your family, is it a chore? Is it tedious, boring, terrible thing that you have to do to go to the supermarket? Well, I can tell you, when I came back, I used to live in Israel. I came back from Israel, I went into the supermarket here, I thought, oh my God, there's so many choices. How lucky am I that I have 42 brands of cereal, 15 different kinds of apples. Amazing. And I remember the first time I used the debit card, I thought, this is miraculous. You can use a debit card? I don't even have that money. How about gardening? How about spending time doing gardening? Is that a chore? Is it horrible that you have to rake the leaves and mow the lawn? Or is it an opportunity to see your land, your property, and imagine what you'd like to do there in the summer, what trees you'd like to plant, what gazebo you want to put up, what garden furniture would make this look really nice. The same experience can be a very positive experience or a very negative experience. We have the capacity to give everything in our lives meaning. Even the most mundane aspect of living can have significance. And if you can imagine that in your own mind, what is the meaning that I can take from this? You'll be willing to take greater risks. If getting to that island has no meaning, you won't ever do it. But if it has meaning, you'll be able to do it. I always think of this example. I work in an office building where there's 4 flights of stairs. And our elevator was out of service for many months while they were rebuilding it. People had to go up and down. Everybody was angry and frustrated, including me. You got to walk up and down the stairs. Then I went to the gym the next day, and I see people in really nice outfits, and they're on the Stairmaster. And they're doing the exact same thing, but they were all happy. Why? You know why? Because the meaning that they had given the very same act was, I'm getting healthy, I'm going to be in shape, and good for me for doing this, and it feels great. That's the craziness of humankind. Our brains will tell us things, and if we don't take control of that, it'll tell us terrible things. But who is doing the telling? That's really one of the things I want you to think about as we go through these ideas. Who is it who's talking to us? Just before I go to that, I skipped something that I think is really important that I want to share with you. I thought about this a lot over the years. People remember the movie Star Wars? Remember the phrase, "May the Force be with you"? So I thought about that. Why did that resonate with so many people? And I think if you think about what we've been talking about tonight, there's this spiritual part of ourselves, and there's this physical part of ourselves. There's a famous scene in the movie. Everybody saw the movie Star Wars? Do you remember Luke Skywalker? And his job is to target the Death Star. And he had to get all the fighter jets, had to get a bomb right into a very particular tight spot. And if you got the bomb in that spot, it would go in, would destroy the Death Star. Everybody's missing it, right? Fighter jets are getting shot out of the sky. And Luke Skywalker has got this amazing technological thing on his helmet, and it's targeting the thing. And do you remember what happens next? You hear the voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Luke. What does he say? Anybody know? Trust the Force. Trust the Force. Right? And then what Luke does is he lifts up the visor, he closes his eyes, and he fires the missile, and of course it goes right into the Death Star. Now, I know it's a fantasy movie, but the thing about George Lucas was that he tapped into some very basic ideas about human nature. And I think this was a real one. I think in my experience, and I'm certainly open to be challenged, but I've been doing this for 30 years, and I can tell you that people that I've worked with have been able to accomplish amazing things when they start to change the way that they look at their world. And they start to trust that inner voice and the higher voice, which is really what I'm trying to highlight here for you. There's a higher voice that we are able to access when we are attached to our right side of our brain and our spiritual self. And I'll give you a simple example of that. People call it serendipity, right? Coincidences, or things that happen that it's hard to explain. So I published this book, The Genesis Paradigm, 4 years ago. And you'll ask me, well, how come it's taken so long to do a book launch? Come and talk to me after, I'll tell you. But it's hard. It was hard. And one of the things that I knew I wanted to do is I wanted to do it in a library. I don't know why. That was my idea. Because like I said earlier, I think books has been a really strong foundation for the beliefs and the ideas that I've come up with. So I wanted to do it in a library. So I called the Toronto Library. And I said to them, I have a book. I want to do a book launch. I thought, what a great idea. And you're going to do it in a library? Sure. No. They said to me, you got to go on the site and you got to do a whole blurb about what you plan to do. What is it? How long will it be? What does it cost? What's the purpose? You do all that, and then it goes out. Any library in the city can access that site and invite you to come and give a talk. I did that 2 years ago. 2 years ago. Never heard a thing. Now, most of us would say, give up, right? Find some other avenue, which I did. I tried other avenues. But about 2 months ago, out of the blue, Obi-Wan Kenobi said to me, how about just looking at the website for this library? Because my practice, the Genesis Center, is just up the street. I have a practice called the Genesis Center up the street. I thought, what better place than the library at Yonge and Lawrence, right near my practice. So I looked on the site, and sure enough, all you had to do was check availability and book a date. And that's what I did. I checked the website. It said to me, I spoke to somebody. Here's the number you call. And you just give them dates, and you find a date that's available. And tonight was the night. So my question to myself is, where did that idea come from? It's hard to give you an answer. I'll show you with another example. Many years ago, I don't know where it came from because nobody in my family's here tonight, will tell you, nobody in my family were sailors. Nobody boated in my life, but I have always had this passion and dream that I'm going to sail a boat. I'm going to learn to sail, and I was riding my bike down the Credit River path, came across the Humber School of Sailing. And I saw this woman working on a boat, preparing to circumnavigate the globe, if you can believe it, probably 30 years old, about to go sailing around the world on her boat. And she said to me, what are you doing here? I said, well, I always dreamed of sailing, and I saw the signs at Humber School of Sailing. She said, well, you know what? If you take 30 days, a month, you can take a course, and I can tell you you'll be sailing your own boat in a month. And I looked at her like she was nuts. I don't know if you've ever seen a sailboat, but it looks really complicated. So I did it. I enrolled in the course. I took a 30-day course, and I've been sailing on Lake Ontario for the past 10 years, sailing my own 25-foot sloop. How did that happen? I think it came from the same place. It's that voice that says to you, this is where you want to go. I'm here to help you. Years ago, there was that book, The Secret. And there was somehow this idea that there was magical thinking that could happen to help you create the life that you want. I don't think it's magical. I think it's mysterious. I give you that. But I don't think it's magical. I think it goes back to what I shared with you at the beginning of the talk, that story with Bill Burnett and the students at Stanford. If you are open to the universe, things will happen that are unexplainable. I could spend the next hour telling you amazing things that have happened in my life, not because it's magic, not because it's anything that I necessarily did. I tapped into that power that's there for all of us. We can all tap into that power. But one of the things that we're going to have to come to terms with is what is pain? Because it's going to be painful. I've lived in New York, I lived in Israel, Toronto. I was born in Toronto. And I had amazing journeys along the way, but each one had its own sense of pain and discomfort to be able to do what I did. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody is up for those kinds of changes. So I don't know what the changes are that you're hoping for in your own lives, but I can tell you that one of the ways that you're going to be able to do it is if you can give a different conception in your own mind about what pain is. You remember that phrase, no pain, no gain? Right? Well, what this says is that pain is a relatively objective physical phenomenon. Suffering is our psychological resistance to what happens. Events may create physical pain, but they do not in themselves create suffering. Resistance creates suffering. Stress happens when your mind resists what is. The only problem in your life is your mind's resistance to life as it unfolds. It's a very profound idea. I don't know how more to highlight for you the difference between the two. What I know is that in childbirth, something that I will never experience, I understand, and I did participate in Lamaze preparing for childbirth, that it's incredibly uncomfortable. But if you resist it, it's incredibly painful and suffering. So I remember women in the birthing room yelling for hours and hours on end. Well, the Lamaze teacher told us that the contraction is only 1 minute. So if you just time out that minute, there might be 10 minutes or 5 minutes or however much time between those contractions where there's no pain whatsoever. And I think it's the same in life. If we are open to what happens to us, then it doesn't seem like suffering. It might be painful, it might be uncomfortable, but discomfort is a necessary part of the process to reach that end goal that you have for yourself. The ability and the capacity to be uncomfortable is what produces change. So as long as I have been working with people in private practice, the more that they try to remain in their comfort zone, the less change they actually accomplish. The more people are willing to take a risk and experience that discomfort, the quicker they're going to reach the goals that they've set for themselves. Anybody remember the saying? I know it's simple, but it's very profound. The past is history, the future is a mystery, every moment is a gift, and that's why it's called the present. I think at the end of the day, there's a necessity to learn the skill of being in the present moment. Being in the present moment, rather than where our mind wants to take us all the time, which is the past and the future, is a very hard thing to achieve. And I want to share with you two stories. One that is a very amazing story by Jill Taylor, who is a famous brain researcher from Harvard. And she wrote an amazing book called A Stroke of Insight. And then I want to share with you a very personal experience. So Jill Taylor was a brain researcher at Harvard, and she was a very bright woman who had been involved in brain research probably her whole adult life. And she began to experience a brain hemorrhage. And she was smart enough and intuitive enough to know that I need to think about what's happening. I'm experiencing a brain hemorrhage. I don't know how any of us would have dealt with that, but she was able to have her wits about her while her brain was experiencing this hemorrhage. And what happened, when you can see it on YouTube, she talks about this story, an amazing story, where she starts to lose left brain function. So her capacity to understand, her capacity to speak, her capacity to walk was diminishing with every minute. Just imagine that, your capacity to understand the world as you know it. disappearing. And she slowly tried to make her way to the den where she had her Rolodex, and she knew she had to call for help. And she made her way to the Rolodex in her den. By the time she got there, she couldn't identify the numbers anymore. All she knew was there were symbols on the business card of their colleague that she worked with that she knew she had to connect with. And so she she couldn't even identify what a phone was anymore. So she knocked the receiver off and tried. It took her 30 minutes, she said. 30 minutes to match the symbols of the number on the Rolodex to the numbers and the symbols on the phone to call her colleague at work for help. At that point, she couldn't even speak anymore. She just mumbled. He saw the number and sent an ambulance to help her. He said, "Don't worry, Joe, we're sending help." A long story short, it took her 8 years to recover from the capacity to walk, to speak, to think again. She's fully functioning now. Her mother moved in with her and spent 8 years helping her become whole again. But the amazing thing about this story is that Jill Taylor wrote a book about it. What was happening to her while the stroke was while it was happening? To all of her colleagues, she should have been dead. They never expected her to recover. She was in a coma, and they never expected her. And if she would recover, she'd be a vegetable. What she writes about is she was in a place that's very, very difficult to describe, but it was a place where there was no left brain function. It was only her right brain to experience what was happening. She was conscious of the whole experience, but in a very, very unusual kind of a way. And she was able to come back. And what she talks about is it was a very hard decision to come back, because wherever she was in that state was so magnificent and so big that she couldn't imagine, how do I go back into Jill Taylor's body? I don't know how I'm going to do that. It seems impossible. So I want to share with you my own experience. My own experience about 2 years ago. I worked in an organization at the time where I worked with a group of managers. And I was supposed to have a manager's meeting, like a lunch in my home. And I set up the room, chairs were all set up, table was set up, and went to sleep. I woke up the next morning, and I went downstairs, showered, got dressed, came back in the living room, and I couldn't identify the room. I didn't know what was going on. I couldn't really understand. Now, what I'm going to tell you is actually very hard to talk about because I don't really remember it. I heard a lot of it from other people, from Brenda, my partner, who may have saved my life, I don't know. But I couldn't tell you where my arm ended and the wall began. I didn't know where everybody was, even though it was my home and I knew that everybody should have, my waking state, everybody should have been at work, and I would have understood that, and I would have understood I set the room up, and I didn't. I had no understanding of what was going on. I had the wherewithal to call Brenda, and I don't remember what I said, but it must have sounded troubling. And she said to me, "I think you should call your doctor." Why would I call my doctor? Like, I couldn't make any sense of what was happening. Well, I got in my car. I don't know when. I don't know how much time went by, but I got in my car and drove to my work. And I got another call from Brenda, who at that point, I guess, had consulted with my sisters, and they all determined I need to go to the hospital. So I went to the hospital. Again, I don't remember this. But what I know is, from the hospital, they called an ambulance and they told me they were sending me to Sunnybrook. Sunnybrook has a stroke protocol. They also assumed that I was having a stroke. I don't remember that part of it. I do remember being in an ambulance thinking, this is strange. Kind of like Jill Taylor's experience, right? This is strange. I think I'm having a brain hemorrhage. And I'm sitting in an ambulance thinking, this is strange. I'm going to a hospital in an ambulance. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't fearful. I was just kind of trying to understand what was happening, and I couldn't. The more I tried, the more I couldn't. And I lost complete track of time. Again, to make a long story short, I ended up being in Sunnybrook Emerge for 3 days. So they did lots of tests and ruled out stroke, ruled out everything. And my diagnosis was TGA, transient global amnesia. That was the diagnosis they gave me. Not so important for our purposes, but the diagnosis was because there was no other signs and symptoms, and I regained full functioning about 24, 48 hours later. Came back to myself. And that was the diagnosis. But what I want to tell you, though, and that's why this book, Stroke of Insight, resonated with me, is I felt very similar to what Jill Taylor talked about. I felt wherever I was during that time was a beautiful, amazing place to be. And I was sad to come back to my waking state. As crazy as that sounds, that's the feeling that I had. And for me, that is a very unbelievable experience that it's hard to describe, but it's evidence, and I encourage you, Jill Taylor is certainly way more credible than I am, to try to get your head around the idea that we are way more than we experience ourselves to be if we allow it. And that's really what I wanted to share with you tonight, is the willingness to go there, to think about how much more fulfilling our lives can be if we allow more of our brain function to permeate our lives. Nowadays, I think it's very, very acceptable. Mindfulness practice, meditation, prayer, music, those kinds of things that allow you, deep breathing, right? Just allow you to go inside to that huge space that we are all connected to. It isn't unique to me, it isn't unique to any of us. We are all part of that. And the more that we can allow that left brain to just take a break, planning and thinking is great. It has its place, it has its time, but it needs to be controlled and managed, because if we just let it run rampant, we lose all the benefit of the capacity to tap into this great world of ours, this amazing world of ours, that will allow us to accomplish the life that we're really seeking to accomplish. Bill Burnett, by the way, you know what his program is called? It's at Stanford. He's an engineer, and his program is called Designing a Life Worth Living. Being open to connectivity, being able to give yourself over to some of those higher thoughts, those impulses that come from who knows where, but we all have the capacity to tap into it, can lead us to amazing, fulfilling, creative lives. So I want to thank you really from the bottom of my heart for coming tonight. It means a lot to me to share these ideas. If you want to continue the conversation, you can put your name on the email list. This is the beginning of what I hope will be many, many more opportunities to talk about these ideas, to share these ideas. One of the things I do in my book is I share many, many examples of real life stories of people that I've worked with. Their stories are the best. I'm just kind of putting some ideas together to share with you, but the amazing thing for me is to see it in practice with people in their real lives. So they're real stories in the book, and I really encourage you to read it, to share it. Thank you again, and there's refreshments in the back, and I'm happy to sign any copies if people want to purchase a book. So thank you very much.